What if I told you that there's one food that you've been consuming your entire life, but is silently wreaking havoc on your health? Now, this is a food that has been so integrated in our diets, and one that I found so increasingly hard to get over and to let go of, because it's in some of our most favorite dishes that we consume. Like I said, it's so integrated in our diets. And the ultimate food substance that I'm referring to is none other than the most notorious food, one that is so much covered in controversy that some even think it's harmless, but is at the root of so many of our chronic conditions that we are suffering from. And the food that I'm referring to is none other than gluten. Now, hello and welcome to my channel. I cover everything that is mind, body, and soul wellness related. In this video, I'm going to deep dive into gluten. Why is it that gluten is wreaking so much havoc on our health and probably at the root cause of many of our chronic conditions? Now, I've personally suffered from chronic acid reflux, and gluten was probably the number one culprit that I needed to eliminate from my diet to get that instant relief, because the symptoms that I experienced from consuming gluten is so aggressive. It's so aggressive that by eliminating it, it will make such a profound difference. So this is one food that is so hard to give up. It's so challenging to give up because so many of us are so addicted to this food, but can make quite a profound difference in our health. And I'm going to deep dive into the reasoning behind it. What are some of the theories that I think should be given much more time and attention to when we're considering, especially if it's someone that is going through some sort of chronic illness. But let's get into what is gluten. What is gluten to even start off with? Now, gluten is essentially the primary protein that is found in wheat, barley, rye. A lot of the breads that we eat have gluten within it, unless we purchase a gluten-free bread. But more on these substitutes in another video, because that's a whole nother rabbit hole. But let's talk about gluten. Why is it that this food substance gluten is having such a detrimental effect? Now, it's not just people who suffer from celiac that need to give up gluten. I think gluten is having a profoundly negative effect on people's health. It's just that it's silently accumulating its negative effects. And some people are fortunate enough not to reach that stage where it manifests as a chronic health illness. However, these days, with the progressive amount of toxicity that we are facing, more and more people are finding themselves becoming victim to a lot of these chronic conditions. And at the root of it is our dietary practices and consuming foods that are wreaking havoc on our gut, that are increasing the inflammation, making us more susceptible to a lot of these chronic health conditions. And so what can we do to help our bodies heal? So like I mentioned, gluten may be at the root of a number of chronic conditions. People suffering from leaky gut, people suffering from autoimmune reactions, people suffering from skin disorders. Gluten may be at the root of a number of these chronic conditions, autoimmune conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, chronic conditions like acid reflux. A lot of these conditions are given rise to because of our consumption of gluten, because of the damage that is wreaking on our gut health. Now let's get into the two theories that I think need to be given quite a lot of consideration, and things that perhaps require an open mind, because some of these may sound a little bit out there. But if you go down the rabbit hole and you start to understand some of the reasoning and the logic behind it, it may start to make sense, especially if you're someone that's suffering from a chronic condition and experience the alleviation of your symptoms by giving up on this food. So let's go into the first school of thought, and that is probably the one that's most prevalent and well known out there, and that is the leaky gut school of thought. So essentially, when we consume these wheat products and they break down, and the gluten that enters into our digestive system is unable to be broken down effectively by our digestive system, and essentially starts damaging the intestinal lining and giving rise to the intestinal permeability. So compromising the integrity of the intestinal walls, which results in a lot of the toxicity that the intestinal walls or the villi were previously preventing from seeping into our bloodstream. So all this now starts to leak into our bloodstream and add to that toxic load, which the liver then needs to clean up. And by doing this, we are overburdening our body with this toxicity, which is giving rise to inflammation, which is giving rise to autoimmune reactions, and essentially a number of chronic conditions that many of us may experience. Poor digestion giving rise to diseases that are chronic, and perhaps even cardiovascular diseases as well, because of the toxicity that's now getting into the bloodstream, and a whole host of other autoimmune conditions. So that is the one theory, is the leaky gut theory, and how this toxicity ends up causing so much of damage to our guts, to our bodies, to our overall health, and culminating in the manifestation of these chronic health conditions. Alright, so let's get into the second school of thought, and that is the medical medium school of thought. And according to medical medium, when we consume gluten, these essentially feed the viruses within our body. Now, many times these viruses are dormant, and it refers to primarily the EBV virus, which is the Epstein-Barr virus, and the strep virus, that are often dormant in our body and perhaps have been in our bodies for many generations, probably come through hereditary or the toxicity that we are exposed to. So these viruses end up feeding on the gluten and releasing neurotoxins and other toxins that then end up leaching into our bloodstream, or which essentially causes a lot of the leaky gut or the intestinal permeability, and that leads into the toxic load in the bloodstream, which then overburdens the liver and the immune system. Essentially, these viruses, they get stronger and stronger from feeding on gluten and end up taking over the liver. Once they take over the liver, they then move on and make their next line of attack towards the thyroid. From the thyroid, they end up then attacking the brain. So once we feed these viruses their primary food sources, we actually strengthen them. They give rise to a number of autoimmune conditions. And it's a theory that I think needs to be given adequate consideration to, given that a lot of the mainstream medicine has not yet caught up on the harmful effects of gluten, and often dismiss it and only look at the celiac aspect of it, and not realizing the detrimental effects that this food is having on our health. Now, we also need to consider the changes to the form of gluten that is being consumed today. So modern day gluten versus the gluten that our ancestors or the previous generations were consuming, which was a much more naturally derived. Gluten wasn't so laden with so many pesticides. Now, the problem with gluten today, it's so highly processed. A lot of it is bleached, and it's not its entire whole food form. So it undergoes so much of processing that it strips out a lot of the fiber content, as well as things that ensure that it's in its whole state. And it's also laden with so many pesticides like glyphosate that make it so much more toxic to our bodies when we do end up consuming it. It's not soaked, so when people consider the phytic acid, it just adds to this culmination of toxicity within our bodies. The way in which it's prepared, now fortunately today you may have things like sourdough, although I have reservations about that too, but they make it a little bit more digestible. But many of the conventional products that we are consuming have not undergone the same fermentation process. So a lot of that gluten has not yet broken down. There still has a lot of these toxicity that is laden within the wheat product that we are consuming. And by consuming this, we are loading our bodies with all this toxicity that is then giving rise to a lot of the inflammation, as well as whichever school of thought you give more credence to is essentially then wreaking havoc on our gut and giving rise to a worsening or progressive worsening of our chronic conditions. So that is why gluten is probably one of those foods that we want to probably strip away from our diet entirely. Now, for someone like myself who's been experiencing chronic acid reflux, I noticed a profound difference when I gave up on gluten. It made quite a huge difference. It was one of the foods that I needed to strip out of my diet in order to enable myself to get off PPIs, because the reaction from consuming gluten while not taking PPIs or trying to get over PPIs was so severe that it wanted me to just reach out and continue with the PPIs. But as soon as I got over and let go of gluten, it allowed for a much more overall improvement in the symptoms related to chronic acid reflux. Now, it doesn't only relate to that. There are so many people who are suffering from skin conditions, psoriasis, acne, that are also due to the consumption of gluten. Now, the problem is so many people think gluten is a healthy food. It's been around, it's in most of our conventional products. If you from an Indian background, think about your naans, your rotis, they are also gluten based. So a lot of us have been consuming these foods, but what is happening is it's causing this increased inflammation in our body. Now, some people may not be at that stage where it's causing or manifesting or showing up as these chronic health conditions. However, they may still be giving rise to lower energy levels or brain fog, things which may not be as apparent as someone who is suffering from a chronic health condition. However, by giving up on gluten, this is when we'll start to notice these effects. So if you're someone that is contemplating giving up on gluten, or someone who's struggling with a chronic condition, perhaps a good exercise to do is to do a 30-day fast where you don't consume any gluten for that 30 days. And I mean quite strictly, where you're looking at every single product and making sure that it doesn't contain gluten, and trying to observe the effects that it has on your health. Try and notice your energy levels, your chronic condition symptoms, whether there's an alleviation of those symptoms, whether there's a drastic improvement. And these practices, like these elimination practices, give us that opportunity to then really dial into what the body's messaging and signaling is telling you. Is this food really beneficial for our health, or is it just hacking into our addiction centers and causing us to eat these foods just because it's becomes so habitual and something that is so addictive and so hard to give up on, because a lot of our comfort foods are gluten based. So this is something that you may want to consider if you're someone who is suffering from a chronic health condition. However, I think generally most people will be better off if we don't consume gluten. I did mention sourdough initially. Now, some people may think, well, if I'm eating sourdough bread, it's better and I can still do it because it breaks down a lot of gluten. That is very true. I have my personal experience with sourdough bread. Now, I tried consuming sourdough bread. However, I found that I was still getting a lot of the acid reflux. It may not have been as severe as consuming normal bread. However, I was still getting chronic acid reflux reactions from consuming things like sourdough bread. The problem is the grain is still not broken down entirely, and it still has the wheat component in it. It still has an inflammatory effect that is still giving rise to inflammation. I still think it's better to let go of it, because if you go down the grain rabbit hole, then you'll realize that a lot of the grains too have some sort of inflammatory effect. However, it may not be as aggressive as the gluten, but it still has an inflammatory effect that is giving rise to a worsening of whatever chronic condition you're experiencing. In my case, it wasn't as aggressive as a conventional bread. However, it was still having some effect, inflammatory effect, that was giving rise to the acid reflux symptoms. So that's why I think sourdough bread, although it's marketed as being this panacea food that solves a lot of problems, I think we need to really think carefully about that. Listen to what your body is telling you. Is your body giving you different messaging? And that may help you in order to make a better decision as to whether this food is beneficial for you or not. As always, if any of this content is helpful, please do hit that like button. Share this with someone who you think can benefit from this message. And please do leave your comments in the comment section below. Are you thinking about leaving gluten? Are you contemplating it? What are your thoughts on the consumption of gluten? With that, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.